Hello and welcome to this 60-minute briefing under the title Managing and Shaping the EU-UK Relationship, What Role for the European Parliament? My name is Jannike Wachowiak and I'm a policy analyst at the European Policy Centre. I'm delighted to be joined by Bernd Lange today. Bernd is a member of the European Parliament where he belongs to the S&D group and he chairs the Committee on International Trade. He also is a member of the Parliament's United Kingdom Coordination Group. Thanks a lot for taking the time to speak to us. It's great to have you here.
Thanks a lot for the invitation. It's a pleasure.
Great. So our discussion today will look at the European Parliament's role in scrutinizing, ratifying and implementing the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the so-called TCA, which was concluded last year in December. And we will also speak about the state of the overall EU-UK relationship. We will start with a few questions from myself to you and then open the floor for questions from the audience as well. And for our audience, as always, there are two ways you can ask questions. You can either write a question into the Q&A box, or you can raise your hand and I will give you the floor later on. If you want to send in a written question, you can do that at any time. And I would ask you to please keep these questions short if possible. So let's turn to today's topic. I do, of course, want to start with the very topical question of ratification. Up until now, the TCA has only been applied provisionally, pending full ratification on the EU side. And initially, a provisional application was due to end on the 28th of February, but was then extended until the 30th of April, which is next week, Friday. That means the plenary next week will be the last opportunity for the European Parliament to ratify the deal unless the EU requests another extension via the Partnership Council or falls back onto a no deal. Of course, the European Parliament, we know that it has refused to set a date for ratification in the plenary so far in response to the UK's unilateral decision to extend grace periods for Irish sea border checks. Already last year, but also again last month, members of the European Parliament, including yourself, made it clear that you will under no circumstances ratify the agreement should the UK breach or threaten to breach the withdrawal agreement. Nevertheless, last week, the deal cleared at least the initial stage and was approved by the two lead committees, AFET and INTA. And you wrote on Twitter that this is not the end of the road and not a free pass, but a sign of the Parliament's constructive attitude, but that future approval in plenary is not a foregone conclusion, and the UK must move on implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol and diffuse current conflicts decisively. So since you made this comment, Vice President Šefčovič has met with his counterpart David Frost to discuss the implementation of the protocol in what he called a constructive and solution-driven atmosphere. And both committed to further negotiations, but there hasn't really been a breakthrough. And at the same time, Šefčovič emphasized that the ongoing legal action against the UK will continue. So this is very briefly where we are at the moment. And now, of course, my question to you is, what will the European Parliament do? Will you vote on the ratification of the TCA next week in the plenary? And if so, what makes you think that the Parliament's condition for ratification, namely that the UK government cannot breach or threaten to breach the withdrawal agreement, is now being met?
Thanks a lot for this introduction and describing the state of the play. And indeed, we in the European Parliament took our time to scrutiny the agreement. And as you rightly mentioned, it was finished on 4 o'clock in the evening on Christmas Day, Christmas Eve. And therefore, it was not possible to have a proper scrutiny process until the 1st of January, and therefore we did this extension of the possibilities via provisional application, which is not our most liked procedure, but nevertheless we choose this. And now we are at a critical moment. Yes, you are quite right. In principle, we are ready with the scrutiny process. So we analyzed quite seriously the agreement and found that most of our interests are proper respected and integrated in the agreement. And then secondly, we agreed also with the Commission on the implementation process and the role of the Parliament. And therefore, we created a resolution which is quite precise in our demands. And on the other side, the Commission made also some clear commitments and will it make in a written procedure also next week, if there will be the vote to the Parliament. So these are two conditions which are fulfilled. And the third one is indeed how the British government is behaving. And there we have still some doubts that they stick to the obligation of the Northern Ireland Protocol. Nevertheless, you're quite right, there was a meeting between Maroš Šefčovič, who was negotiating on behalf of the European Union, and David Frost on a kind of roadmap for the fulfillment of the obligation of the Northern Ireland Protocol. And the negotiations are going on, regardless that we will stick to the normal procedure of an infringement as it is foreseen in the protocol. And this will be on the table until there will be a proper common agreed roadmap. But at the moment, the way for such a roadmap are quite promising. So we have some items where we can, I think, agree on some grace periods, as we did on the 17th of December as well. So I think on some custom formalities, there might be a differentiation between companies which will really export products from Northern Ireland to the European Union and let's say a supermarket in Northern Ireland, or the necessity for conformity declarations might be also have a more a longer grace period because the companies have to recognize the necessity on that. And so there are a lot of possibilities. I will not go into the detail, and because, as I mentioned, the negotiations are going on. Secondly, there are some serious problems. For example, there is a clear commitment that the European Union should have access to the custom IT system. And of course, this access can only be realized if the system is running quite well. And this is not the case at the moment. So there are really technical problems. And thirdly, and this is perhaps one of the really controversial items, are the SPS standards, so the standards for foodstuff and animal products. There are, I think, no room for maneuver and no room for extensions or grace periods, because it's clear that we want to have a clear protection for our citizens, specifically having in mind that a few years ago, BSE was coming from Britain to the European Union. So this is a little bit the tricky issue, how to guarantee that these controls will happen and the SPS standards will be recognized. So this means there is opportunity to reach an agreement on this obligation for the Northern Ireland Protocol. And therefore, it is likely that the Parliament will give the consent to the agreement next week.
Thank you. So it is likely. I I take that as it's very probable that it will happen. I mean, is it correct that the decision on setting a date will be made tomorrow by the heads of the group?
That's right. So I will join this wonderful meeting tomorrow morning at 10:20, I guess, the conference of presidents. So the group leaders will meet and discuss and decide.
Okay. And I mean, it sounds as if it's quite likely that you will decide to set a date to ratify next week. If you ratify next week, do you worry that you might lose your leverage vis-a-vis the UK in order to ensure the full implementation of the withdrawal agreement going forward?
Not really, because the procedure, the infringement procedure is going on. And of course, inside the TCA, there are a lot of, let's say, security nets, which will be used. And because of this arrangement with the Commission, the Parliament will have also the possibility to start an investigation on, for example, violation of certain obligations, and start also perhaps countermeasures. So I'm quite confident that the possibilities of the Parliament to force the British government to stick to the obligation is given. But of course, this should be not the normal way to deal with a partner and an ally. We should really try to overcome this irritation and find a proper way to rebuild trust.
I wanted to ask you about another aspect which you mentioned in your first input, which is the role of the European Parliament in implementing the TCA. And I mean, looking at recent events, it's quite clear that scrutiny of the implementation will be very important, and the European Parliament has been pushing for a stronger involvement in the implementation of the TCA. So from the Parliament's point of view, what powers should the European Parliament have in monitoring the agreement, and how confident are you that the Parliament will actually be able to play such a role?
Of course, this TCA is a living agreement, similar to other agreements, but specifically here we have, I think, around about 20 committees and the Partnership Council to decide on different aspects on the further development of the agreement. And therefore, it's really crucial to have a democratic oversight about the development. So, and therefore, we started to negotiate with the Commission to have a clear arrangement for the implementation process. And we want to have an interinstitutional agreement on that as well. It's a little bit complicated to negotiate this and to formalize this. I remember very well when we made an interinstitutional agreement with the Commission on several aspects of information and cooperation in 2010. It took 1 year to finalize this. But nevertheless, the Commission will present a declaration where the right of the Parliament will be strengthened more than compared to other trade agreements. So there is a clear involvement of Parliament in the Partnership Council. So we will get all the information, the documents, and the Commission will discuss and have an involvement of the Parliament before the Partnership Council is dealing with the development of the agreement. And this is also valid for all the other committees related to the committees of the European Parliament. So transparency, information, access to all documents, and of course, the procedure, if there will be some change, is also clear that this is really related to the consent of the European Parliament, specifically regarding the revision on the level playing field, perhaps after 4 years, and on fisheries after 5 years. So there are different timelines inside this agreement. Then, of course, we can also start an investigation if there is a violation of some elements, or there is a divergence in legislation so that some rebalancing measures are necessary. And the Commission guaranteed to take the wish of the Parliament on board, and if they are not going to align with the Parliament, then they will explain publicly what are the reasons for, and we will start a discussion process. So there is a strong commitment by the Commission in a written form. That's also important for the involvement of the Parliament, and it's quite unique and goes far over the other normal practice of the involvement of the Parliament. So I'm quite convinced that we will have a proper role in the implementation process.
Thank you. Just a short follow-up question on these aspects of the implementation of the deal. I wanted to ask you about this parliamentary assembly that is suggested by the TCA. So the TCA states that the European Parliament and the House of Commons may establish a parliamentary partnership assembly as a forum to exchange views on the partnership. Can you tell us a little bit about this assembly? Is this a priority for the European Parliament? Do you know anything about how this might look like? And are plans to set this up already underway?
This was also a clear wish by the Parliament. By the way, the Intercommittee introduced such a parliamentary oversight body also in the agreement with Vietnam. So we have a commitment by the National Assembly from Vietnam and the European Parliament to establish such an oversight body. And therefore, yes, we wanted to have it here as well, because I'm totally convinced in the bottom of my heart that trade policy and the implementation of trade policy has to put the people first. And this is really linked to a democratic exercise and not just for the normal executive practice. And now we have to formulate how this body is working, the procedures, who is a member. I guess on the European side, there will be, as we had also in the relation to other parliaments worldwide, delegations. There will be a UK delegation, and I guess that this delegation will be the main part of this parliamentary body. But of course, as it is a trade and cooperation agreement, the Intercommittee has to play a role as well. Let's see what on the British side in the House of Commons will be have ideas for such a body. This has to be formulated by the two parliaments. And besides this parliamentary body, of course, we have in our committee, in the Intercommittee, a UK monitoring group, which is now, after the conclusion of the negotiation, responsible for the implementation. And the Commission is also in the declaration quite clear that the relevant committee, and in this case, the monitoring group, will be a key player in the implementation on the European side. But nevertheless, this model of a parliamentary body should be also a model for future trade agreements.
Thank you. Yeah, that clears things up a bit. I guess that means that it is still unclear at what point this will be up and running. Or do you have a timeline for that?
No, not at all. No.
Okay.
Of course, the problem is on the British side, the House of Commons is not so deeply involved in the exercise as the European Parliament is. little bit linked to some pieces of legislation the Conservative Party under Boris Johnson brought into the House of Commons, and unfortunately it was adopted. So let's see how they will establish the scrutiny body. So it will take some time, I guess.
Okay, thanks. I want to move on a bit from these questions about implementation and interinstitutional arrangements and ask you a bit more about the substance of the TCA. So, I mean, this agreement was negotiated under immense time pressure and with firm red lines on both sides. And the deal that was finally concluded last year establishes a partnership with the UK that is probably more distant and less comprehensive than the EU would have hoped. So what is the European Parliament's verdict on that? Do you think this agreement provides a good basis for managing the relationship over the next years and decades?
So you're quite right. This agreement is more or less a normal trade agreement. And this was a wish of the British government. Indeed, not our wish. There would have been some other possibilities, so close cooperation like we did with Norway, or in a little bit lower level with Switzerland. But the British government wanted to have just a normal trade agreement. And by the way, this is not in line with the political declaration we had so far accompanied the withdrawal agreement. So this is also another case where the British government is not really sticking to some agreement they signed. Even this political declaration was not legally binding, but it was a declaration signed by both sides. So normal trade agreement, and yes, because of this wish of the British government, we have also some normal obligations and normal regulations, like in other trade agreements as well. And we had always a discussion with the British side that on the one side of the coin, the British side wishes to have market access, but on the other side, not respecting European standards. This was in several elements. I could tell hours and hours about the negotiation where we have conflicts regarding this principle. And at the end of the day, there is an agreement which is clear that market access is only possible if the European standards will reach. This means there is no principal recognition by the UK side on the European standards. So the fulfillment of the European requirements has to demonstrate it case by case. So producers in the UK have to certify their products that they are in conformity with the European standards, and on the foodstuff, similar way. And this is really a harmful process for a lot of companies and for the supply chains, which are really have a close link between the production process inside the European Union and the UK. But this is a political wish of the government.
Yeah, so what I take from that is that you also think it's a rather thin deal, and that has been disruptive to the trading relationship. My second question then would be, it is a thin deal, okay, but do you think it is a stable deal? There have been many commentators, including at the EPC, who are saying that while it is much better than a no deal, of course, the TCA remains a rather shaky foundation for the next stage of EU-UK relations. And you already said yourself that this is a very dynamic agreement, and It includes several grace periods, transitional periods, and also reviews of parts of the agreement and the entire agreement as well. And if I counted correctly, there are at least 13 ways to terminate all or parts of the agreement. So that means we could still end up in a no deal-like state if either the UK or the EU decides to terminate the TCA or takes harsh retaliatory measures, which might then result in its unraveling. So do you think this TCA will actually stand the test of time and be a stable basis for the relationship for the years to come?
So I have not my crystal ball here with me. So to answer this question is a little bit complicated, but it's really depending on the behavior of the British government, I guess. So at the moment, I will give no guarantee that it will stand because we have so many controversial discussions with the British government so far. But nobody knows what the development will bring and how long this government will stay and so on and so on. So there is room for improvement in the agreement, but also room for narrow down the agreement. And of course, we have to discuss several elements. So you mentioned the question of level playing field. This is kind of safeguard we ask for. So if there is a divergence between the legislation inside the European Union and the United Kingdom, where some trade advantages, competition advantages are created by a lower level of environment legislation, for example, or labor legislation, or state aid inside the United Kingdom, then of course there is the possibility to set rebalancing measures, so limiting access to the European market or setting tariffs or whatever. And therefore this principle, no tariffs, no quotas, which should be the general principle, it's not given forever because there is a clear possibility that this will change. Or the question of rules of origin is a problem now for some producers in the UK. And of course, we can try to find a more general solution for that. But it's really depending on the negotiation process. Or the question of fisheries. So this was, to my surprise, one of the key discussions we had even in the last days of the negotiations. Naive, like I was, I thought the question of financial services would be one of the most important issues from the British side, but it wasn't. The fish was the most exciting element, and we found a compromise in the last minute. And it's, I think, also a complicated issue to have the revision process in 5 years and find then a common solution for the future. So there are some obstacles in the air, and this agreement is not finished. And let's see how the conflicts and the irritations which are there fits in and what the future will bring.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that a lot depends on the UK government, and of course you don't have a crystal ball, but I guess it is still important to think about how the future relationship will develop and evolve, and how the EU and the UK can work together constructively. And but the first months since the provisional application of the TCA, in these months, the relationship has been off to a rather rocky start. We have had the dispute about the diplomatic status of the EU mission in London, a clash over vaccines, and then there's of course the ongoing legal proceedings against the UK government for violating the Northern Ireland Protocol, which we already mentioned. So my question would be, what do you think? How can you build a trusting relationship with someone who benefits from politicizing the relationship and will quite likely declare any success, any domestic success in the UK as a Brexit dividend and blame any negative impact on the EU? How do you think the EU should respond to this? How should the EU approach this quite conflictive relationship going forward?
Yeah, first of all, it's a question of the electors in Britain to decide about their government, and this is not my duty. Let's see what the next election will bring. In my point of view, the promises Boris Johnson made are quite high, and I'm not sure that he can deliver. At the moment, of course, we have a mix between the consequences of the Brexit and the COVID-19 pandemic. This will be changed in the next year. And then, of course, the decrease in the GDP will be clear, and the problems in be connected in supply chain with the European market will be occur. So there will be a potential of internal discussion inside the UK as well. And on the other side, we will defend our interests, no doubt about. As you mentioned quite rightly, we have problems with the diplomatic status, and this leads for me, for example, to the consequence that at the moment I have no contact with British diplomats, because I will not accept any diplomatic contacts without having a clear recognition of the European Union by the government. Or the question of the vaccine and the supply in vaccine, it's also clear that we have our interests and we stick to our interests regardless who is the Prime Minister. Or the question of foreign policy and security policy. By the way, in the political declaration, with the withdrawal agreement signed by both sides, also requested an agreement on common foreign policy and security policy. And this was also rejected by the British government. And at the moment, they are playing also their own role in the international court. And this has to be also discussed in the future. So let's see how the British people will react on the consequences of Brexit. So the doors are open here on the European side for further cooperation and even increase the possibilities of relations. So it's depending on the decision inside the British people.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that obviously, well, a lot depends on the UK government, as in they, for example, if you look at foreign policy, they are currently not interested in any form of institutionalized cooperation with the EU and don't really show any desire of strengthening their relationship with the EU in this area. But I guess there's still also a question on what the EU wants out of this relationship, considering that the UK is a former member state, a former large member state with an important role to play in certain areas of mutually shared interest, and the EU and the UK have a lot of mutual interest when it comes to a global agenda, be it on multilateralism or climate change, or also more often than not on foreign policy. So in spite of the difficulties on the UK side, do you think the EU should also have a strategy with view to managing and engaging with this relationship? And are there any starting points you see for rebuilding trust and cooperation? Any areas you think where this is maybe more realistic than in others? If foreign policy, for example, is not so realistic, but do you see other areas where we could see a restart of the cooperation?
No, I think in the multilateral system, the question of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, there are still this similar interests on a rules-based system, specifically regarding some modernization of the rule book on the green products, and also specifically regarding the digital side, so the e-commerce. We are working quite closely together, so there's a common interest. And now with the new Biden administration, there are also some new prospects for modernizing the WTO. And of course, the contacts with the British side are not really totally cut down. So, for example, we had, as European Union, some arrangement with trading partners worldwide, with 22 countries worldwide, on so-called tariff quotas. So, for example, US, United States, Argentinian are allowed to export to the European Union some quotas on beef, tariff-free. It's a long story. I will make it short. Nevertheless, after Britain left the European Union, there was a necessity to renegotiate these tariff quotas and divide the quotas between Britain and the European Union. And of course, there was a different interest between meat and soya and other agricultural products, mainly agricultural products. And this was possible. So at the end of the day, there is a basis for having also a regional decision, even on some other terms. There are still irritations.
Thanks for this. I wanted to ask you something which maybe takes us back a bit to 2016 and the time of the Brexit referendum, because at the time there was a fear in Europe that there might be a domino effect and an unraveling of the EU project in response to this Brexit road. This didn't materialize, and rather quite the opposite. And the EU at the moment continues to see Brexit as a mistake. It's perceived as a failed project, and this is in part also due to the EU's own success in these negotiations, in keeping a very remarkably united front throughout the 4 years of the negotiations, and also negotiating a deal that safeguards the EU's vital interests. But do you think that there is maybe a risk that over time the perception of Brexit in Europe and in the UK might start to slowly change, and that this domino effect might return? So we are already seeing how quickly perceptions can change. For example, if you look at the vaccine rollout in the UK, which has been rather successful so far, and we had a major German tabloid titling "Dear British, we envy you," summing up the mood on the continent. And there was a poll conducted by Bloomberg which said that almost 2/3 of British respondents credited the success of the rollout to Brexit. And while this might be questionable, it still gives us an indication of how quickly public perceptions can change. And obviously at the moment you have the economic and the political fallout from Brexit. So I think, yeah, it's definitely seen as a mistake on the EU side right now. But do you worry that this perception might change over the time, and this so-called domino effect might be back in a few years' time?
Yeah, first of all, you're quite right that public perception of a current development is quite fragile, and it might be changed. So look to the fishermen in the UK, which voted more or less totally for the Brexit, and this has changed. There was a demonstration against Brexit in London from the fish industry. So That is a more matter of principle. The question, should we focus on such populistic movement and stick to populistic tendency as a form of government or governance, like Boris Johnson or Donald Trump did? Or should we stick to the parliamentarian representative democracy? And of course, you can imagine I'm a fan of the second part of the game. And by the way, fortunately, the German CDU has also decided to stick to the second way of governance in their decision who should be the candidate for Chancellor in Germany. And this is a proper way to deal with problems we are faced with. And I'm convinced that on a long run, this will lead to proper results. And I think the election inside the United States shows a similar way. I'm not really curious about some populist developments inside the European Union. And secondly, there is no domino effect at the moment. You're quite right. The front was totally united between left-wing dominated governments and right-wing governments, because the consequences are quite evident. And we will see how this will be received inside the British community after a while. And even right-wing parties which discussed Brexit or Brexit or whatever, I didn't hear anymore. Even Viktor Orban now saying we have to reform the European Union and not to leave Hungary from the European Union. I think the only right-wing party which decided really to leave the European Union is the Alternative for Germany in Germany. Yeah? But even in this field of the political spectrum, they are quite isolated. So I don't expect that there will be a domino effect anymore. And of course, there are a lot of countries negotiating with the European Union to become a member of the European Union. So no, I'm quite reluctant. And thirdly, with the UK, of course, there's a long history which is a little bit different to history of the continental countries. And this has to be taken into account as well. So several moments where I think politically the democratic structure of the European Union is quite well developed.
Thank you. Before going to our next question, I just wanted to remind the audience that you can send in questions, or you can also raise your virtual hands. I saw that earlier we had a raised hand from John Palmer, which is now not there anymore. So John, if you still want to ask your question, just raise your hand again and we will give you the floor. But you can, of course, also send in a written question in the Q&A box, just as a reminder. I wanted to ask you about something that you mentioned earlier, which was about your surprise that the UK government wasn't more interested in negotiating a good deal on financial services. And financial services, is something where there was something in the deal, but not a lot. And but we have now seen that last month it was there was a memorandum of understanding, which basically establishes kind of a talking shop for regulatory cooperation, but there still hasn't been an equivalence decision on financial services by the European Union. So of course, there's also the aspect of competition here, with some EU member states quite interested in attracting these services to their own capital markets. So I was wondering how you see this situation develop, and if you think there is still a chance for an equivalence decision, or if you think it is rather unlikely.
It's totally clear, Anke, that there will be no free access to the market with these 5 passports as we have it so far. That's for sure. And regarding the actual situation, of course, there are a lot of companies moving from London to Paris or Frankfurt or whatever, on the insurance side, but also on the derivative side and on others as well. And you can really count the workplace which the City of London lost. And secondly, some companies in London are saying the European market is not the most important market. We want to be free of any kind of regulation and any oversight by the authorities, and we will look on other markets in Asia or wherever. And therefore, at the moment, the pressure from the City of London is not so high, I guess, that there is a really push for getting some understanding on the financial services. So nevertheless, there will be some talks, and I assume that perhaps there will be on some sectors also some equivalence decisions, but not in general and not under all conditions. Even in the negotiations, it was clear that if there is a market access, the European standards have to be accepted, and this has to be also part of the equivalence decisions. So as you remember, during the negotiations, the proposal by the UK government was totally free market access and national treatment, the regulation. So this is, of course, not possible. So yes, I expect in some sectors there will be a possibility for British financial services to have market access, but not in a general term.
Okay, thank you. We have in the meantime received a question from the audience from Jack O'Connor, which I would like to take next. I think the question is a bit about the narrative on what Brexit means for the European Union, but also for the UK in terms of the economic impact. And he suggests that it might have been unwise to basically allow the narrative that the UK economy would do not as well as a remainder of the EU post-Brexit. And he asked if it isn't the case that the UK and the EU will both not prosper as much as they would have without Brexit. So I guess there's also a bit of question about how symmetric or asymmetric is the economic impact of Brexit on the EU and the UK side, and yeah, how should we talk about this?
Yeah, of course, we will not put the finger to the Brits and say, you are the loser. Huh? That makes no sense. Huh? But of course, there will be loss on both sides. Huh? So in general, they are exporting around about 50% of their exports to the European Union, in some sectors even higher, so in the fish, for example, and the European Union is exporting less than 10% of the exports to the United Kingdom. And these figures, I think, make clear where the costs are and the problems might be. But this is not, let's say, a perspective for the future looking to the past. So let's really focus how we can have a common understanding for the necessary developments under the frame of the TCA for the recovering after the corona pandemic.
Thank you for replying to this question. I hope that answered Jack's question. And yeah, I wanted to ask a follow-up question or kind of related question to what we discussed on financial services, because there's another area which is also closely related, which is data transfers, which are quite important also for the financial service industry. And so there was a transition period of 6 months as part of the TCA on data transfers. And at the moment, it looks as if the EU will grant data adequacy to the UK. But there is still a lot of uncertainty, I think, whether this will actually stand the test of time, and the EU will review this data adequacy every 4 years, I think, and it obviously depends on how standards develop in the UK. So what are your views on this? Do you think this is something that might potentially not stand the test of time?
So, Jannike, this equivalency decision on data flow, but also financial services and other areas, are not an agreement. So these are decisions, and they they are limited in time, and they can really also cut off in 30 days. So it's a kind of unsecure basis for business. But as the United Kingdom wanted to have it, they got it. On the data front, I guess they speculated to have a deal with the United States under Trump, a trade agreement in quite short time. And of course, the United States have a different view on data protection for personal data. As you know, we have with the United States even today some discussions about the privacy shield, and this was not accepted by the European Court of Justice, and we have to renegotiate the possibility of data flow and the management of personal data inside the United States. So this is a different thinking about data protection, and I think the British side wanted to have the open door for the deal with the US side, and I guess there are some other issues as well where they wanted to have this open door. But as you know, the government in the United States changed, and specifically Joe Biden is quite clear on his requirements for trade agreements. Therefore, I think now they're a little bit more reluctant to have also some clear obligations for the protection of personal data on board. And of course, we will review this consequently. So there's no doubt about that our regulation is the standard. By the way, it is really more or less a worldwide standard for the protection of personal data, and we would not really go away from this wonderful legislation we made some years ago.
Thank you. Considering that we don't have any other questions from the audience, and we only have 5 minutes left, I think I would like to ask you two concluding questions before we wrap up. Two very short questions. First of all, do you think the European Parliament will give its consent to the deal next week? Yes or no, basically. And are you optimistic, or are you rather cautious about the future EU-UK relationship? Do you think conflict and friction will dominate the relationship for the next years, or are you an optimist?
I'm always an optimist. Otherwise, I wouldn't be not in politics. And I think mankind is really able to change the world to the better. And therefore, I will continue the dialogue with the British side, with the British Parliament, but even with the government if the conditions are right. And this is really the key question. So what the wish of the British government is, as I mentioned before, our doors are open. Let's see what they want to do and how the internal domestic development in the United Kingdom is. We have the elections in Scotland on the 6th of May, I guess, and some other elements have to be taken into account as well. So let's see. And on the first question, yes, it's really depending on the decision tomorrow on the Conference of Presidents, the group leaders, and of course, information Maroš Šefčovič will give about the discussion on the roadmap for the Northern Ireland Protocol with the British side so far. But I guess, there will be a vote next week. And if there will be a vote, then I guess a big majority of the Parliament will vote in favor. But nevertheless, then of course the Parliament is also ready to use all the instruments foreseen in the TCA to respect the interests of the people on both sides of the channel.
Great. Yeah, thank you for taking the time to talk to me today and for answering all the questions and giving us your insights into the state of the EU-UK relationship. And yeah, we will wait to hear what comes out of the meeting tomorrow and whether we have a vote next week or not. But talking to you, I have the feeling that there will be a vote. Yeah, thanks again for taking the time. It's much appreciated. And thanks to our audience for listening. And I wish you a nice afternoon or evening, depending on where you are, and speak to you soon.
Thanks a lot. All the best.